Want to know what the 5 most common interview questions are, but also how to nail them so that you stand out from amongst your competition? If so, then stay tuned. Hey, I'm Kevin Ruiz with Interview Victory. And I might be dating myself here, but when I was a kid, there was a cartoon every Saturday morning. I'm sure a lot of you have heard of it. It's called 𝐚𝐥𝐰𝐸 Joe. And if you guys were watching it with me, you'll remember that at the end of every episode, there was this corny phrase that went, "Now you know, and knowing is half the battle." Now that last little bit, knowing is half the battle, is ultimately the key to a lot of things in life. And interview success is no exception. The fact is that candidates who show up unprepared for their interviews are more likely to fail those interviews. So preparation is key to interview success. But what if you prepare for the wrong interview questions? Or what if you don't prepare enough for the ones that they actually ask on your interview? Well, it's no surprise that you risk not doing very well in your interview despite having prepared. So, as 𝐚𝐥𝐰𝐸 Joe might say, knowing which interview questions are indeed the most common, which ones you're likely to get on the interview, well, that's half the battle to interview success. Plus, there's one little extra bonus you get from knowing which interview questions are the most common, which is that because the 5 most common interview questions are arguably the 5 most important questions in your interview, having fantastic responses to these questions will help to make up for the questions that you're not fully prepared for. In my experience, these 5 questions, they make up the foundation of a successful interview. So if you kill it on these 5 questions, if your responses for these questions are outstanding, then guess what? You can probably get away with just okay responses. Not necessarily amazing, but just good enough responses for the other interview questions that you may not have prepared for. Now, I'm not saying you shouldn't strive to have great answers for every single question on your interview, but there's always going to be a number of them that you're just not going to be able to prepare for because they're going to come out of left field. If you get those 5 questions right, you're more likely to be forgiven for less than stellar responses for those other interview questions in general. They're common amongst nearly all types of interviews, and they apply to almost every field or industry out there. You could think of them as universal because these 5 questions usually get to the heart at what most interviewers want to know about you as a candidate. Now that said, that doesn't mean that you can ignore industry-specific interview questions based on experience and knowledge. You can think about fields such as engineering or law or medicine, where you really do have to have a pretty thorough understanding of the field and subject, and you're going to be asked specific questions about the industry itself. Nonetheless, even if you get these industry-specific questions down perfectly in your interview, and let's say you are being considered neck to neck with another candidate that also has done really well in that area, they know their industry very well, they know they have a lot of experience and knowledge similar to you, and you're being compared and evaluated against that candidate, these 5 questions are where you can kind of pull ahead of that individual by ensuring that you are a great fit for the organization. So hopefully I've convinced you of how important these 5 questions are. Now let's get to the questions, shall we? The first question is, tell me about yourself. This is literally the most common of all interview questions out there, and it's most often the first real question you're likely to get in your interview. I also believe it's the most important interview question out there. Why? Well, have you ever heard that saying that most people can tell whether or not they like someone within the first 5 seconds of meeting them? This truly open-ended question gives the interviewers that chance to get a solid first impression of you. Your personality, your confidence, how well you speak, as well as your attitude. The moment your mouth opens and starts talking, they're rapidly deciding how much they like you and how much they don't, even before you really tell them anything substantial. Now, once they've decided that they like you enough, then they'll start actually paying attention to the things you have to say in this response. However, if in those first 5 or 20 seconds they decide they don't particularly like you, well, then they'll do their best to pay attention to you, but who knows? Their attention may start drifting off, even if they're looking straight at you. So that's why it's really important that you start strong with this response. You start with a lot of positive and enthusiastic energy because this is going to set the tone for the rest of the interview. And after you've gotten their attention by starting strong, then you need to keep their attention by talking about all the interesting things about you and effectively answer the question that they are wondering, which is, why should I care about you? The second question, what are your strengths and weaknesses? Now this question can be asked as one question, strengths and weaknesses, or sometimes they'll ask it in 2 questions. It kind of a back-to-back, meaning they'll ask you the first question about your strengths, and then after your response, they'll ask you the second question about your weaknesses. Interestingly, there's a pretty consistent pattern amongst interviewers with this question in that you'll almost always be asked to discuss your strengths first and your weaknesses second. Now, why do you think this is? Well, because most candidates don't feel comfortable discussing their weaknesses in an interview. They want the job or they want the acceptance or whatever, and they worry that if they talk about their actual weaknesses or character flaws, the interviewer will reject them. So the trick that interviewers have found to bait candidates into more comfortably talking about their weaknesses is to allow them to first talk about their strengths with the hope that after they'll feel more confident in disclosing those weaknesses. And that begs the question, do they even really care about your response to what are your strengths? Well, it's hard to know. Kind of. It can somewhat be useful to them as a question, but let's think about it this way. 98% of your interview, you're talking about your strengths anyway. That's sort of the entire goal for you as a candidate. So do they really need to know more about your strengths than they've already learned or they already will learn in the rest of the questions? Probably not. Mostly, they're just trying to get your weaknesses out of you. And with that in mind, one of the biggest mistakes that I see candidates making in response to the question, what are your strengths and weaknesses, is that candidates will accidentally spend over 70% of their response talking about their strengths and spend very little or no time at all talking about their weaknesses. Remember, they want to see if you're self-aware of your weaknesses. So make sure that you have authentic and actual weaknesses that you can discuss for this response, not just a pseudo weakness. Of course, discussing your weaknesses in an interview is an art in itself. You want to be careful that you don't choose a weakness that makes you look bad. So you must choose carefully. So before we get into the third most common interview question, let me ask you guys a question. In one word, what would you say is your biggest strength? Do me a favor and write your biggest strength down in the comment area below. I think it'll be useful to get an idea for what some of the more commonly mentioned strengths are. And if you're finding this video helpful so far, why not like this video down below and click on the subscribe button? That way you'll always know when I put out another video to help you master your next interview. And if you have an upcoming interview, please make sure to grab my day of the interview checklist. Now this is a free PDF checklist that I've put together that will help you be super prepared for your upcoming interview. All you gotta do is click on the link in the description below to download it. Print it out a few days before your interview and check off everything as you go to make sure that you have everything you need on the day of the interview and that you have thought about everything that you'll need to think about. This checklist has been a lifesaver for me, and it's something that's helped me succeed on every major interview I've been to in the past decade, so check it out. Alright, so the third most common interview question is, why do you want to work for us? Or why do you want to come to our school or program? Now this is such a crucial question, and it's one of the questions that you need to spend extra time and energy preparing for. And I want to give you a little hint about how you know whether you have a mediocre to terrible response for this right now, if your response is simply not up to par. If you're able to take your current response and say nearly the same thing in a different interview with a different organization or company, well then you know that your answer to this question probably sucks. For example, if my response to this question is, hey, this looks like a great place to work. People here seem really friendly and hardworking, and I've heard and read a lot of great things about this company. Well, guess what? There's literally nothing specific about the company in what I just said. And so all I did in that response was showcase to the interviewers, hey, I didn't really do much research about your company and I'm just here answering questions on the fly. And to be honest, that rubs interviewers the wrong way. It can even be seen as sort of a slap in the face. Basically, it's like you saying, you know, I just don't have much interest in learning anything about your company. Now I'm here to tell you that simply does not excite interview committees, so make sure you have a unique and specific response to this question. Number 4, where do you see yourself in 5 years? Sometimes this question is asked another way, which is, what are your short-term and long-term career goals? Now there's a few important reasons why employers and organizations want to know the answer to this. First, most companies and academic programs like to see a sense of hunger and ambition in candidates. Ambition is a healthy sign, and it's usually an attractive attribute in candidates. Someone who has goals, someone who has dreams, and who is thinking about how to accomplish those goals is more likely to actively contribute to that organization, to be a team player, and to try to improve the company or organization versus someone who only wants a job to pay their bills and doesn't really care much about where they are in 5 years. Moreover, Interviewers often assume that people who don't have dreams for their future are much less motivated to work as hard. On the other hand, you gotta be careful about looking too hungry when responding to this question. When I was a hiring manager, I remember interviewing a few candidates who basically told me that in 5 years, they wanted to have my job. Now to the candidate, that may have sounded like it was a compliment to me, but I'll be super honest with you. To me, it sounded more like a little bit of a threat and somewhat at a certain level of entitlement. The key with this is always to achieve balance in the majority of your interview responses. Now finally, question number 5. The 5th most common interview question is one of the toughest ones. Why should we hire you? Put another way, why should we select you over other candidates? Now this is a very common question, and it lets interviewers see how good of a salesperson you really are in terms of selling yourself and showcasing your confidence in your ability to succeed once hired or accepted. Sometimes this question is asked near the end of an interview, but it's not uncommon for it to be asked right at the start as well. If it is at the start of your interview, then it's yet another way for the interviewers to have you help them learn about what the most impressive job or program-related qualifications are that you have, neatly summarized for them. They like this because interviewers, well, they're very busy people with a lot on their plates. They'd rather someone else help them with the hard problems like, hey, which candidate should we hire? By asking the questions to the candidates themselves, they can offload some of that mental processing work to you, the candidate. Instead of having to figure out how you're better than your competition, they can just have you tell them that. Now, if you sell them on yourself, great. Maybe you get selected. And if you do a bad job selling yourself, well, that's great as well for them because now you've just helped them make the candidate list smaller, which means they don't have to do as much thinking and work their brains as hard. But what if, on the other hand, this question comes near the end of the interview? Well, they probably know most everything about you that's of interest by now, but they're giving you one last chance to make a final sales pitch to them and possibly tip the scales in your favor for why the qualifications you have are going to be valuable and a good fit for the organization. Well-prepared interview candidates shouldn't have too difficult of a problem selling themselves. So it's up to you to create that narrative, to create that final sales pitch. Okay, so those are the 5 most common, and I would argue most important questions to prepare for on your upcoming interview. Now with all these questions, if you'd like to go a little deeper and get into the nitty-gritty of how to craft great responses to them, I'm going to put some videos over on this side. I want you to check them out, and those will help you get into those questions a little further and a little deeper. All right, everybody. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you again in another video.